So I'm Finn Lowe. I'm the chief editor of 8.9.com. That's the number 8, the word point, the number 9.com. And we're the UK's land use news channel. So please, if you haven't already, check us out and have a listen to the Farmgate podcast, which is our podcast. You can find that on all good podcast channels by searching for Farmgate. So that's me. The last you'll hear from me for a little while in terms of what I do. I just want to thank you for joining us. We are the third in a series of webinars where we're going to discuss the outlook for the rural sector. Today, we're going to be focusing on changes to planning and inheritance tax policy and the implications of these changes on rural development. We've got 3 expert speakers, as you can see, with us again today from within the Rural Solutions team. Sally Ormiston is a director at Rural Solutions. Nicole Wright is the head of planning, and James Ellis is the Rural Solutions planning director. Sally Ormiston leads a team of advisors working nationally with estates and other landowners to create successful rural businesses through the development of land and property. She leads Rural Solutions work with public sector landowners and on rural affairs. Sally's going to provide an overview of current influences and opportunities for the rural sector, including introducing planning policy macro changes and talk about planning policy opportunities and local plans. Nicole Wright oversees the planning team. She's an expert on strategic planning and development and advises clients on the full range of planning issues. Nicole works closely with clients to develop long-term strategic plans for farms and estates, and she's spent much of the past 20 years in East Anglia delivering schemes from concept to completion. She's also advised internationally on housing policy and planning policy at central government level. And today she's going to provide an overview of the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, the housing targets and consultations on planning reform. And finally, James Ellis is a director in the Rural Solutions planning team, working with clients across various sectors to obtain planning consent in sensitive and constrained rural locations. James specialises in complex planning work and strategic promotion and master planning for large-scale developments. And James is going to be talking about rural housing, green belt and other policy changes.
A few minutes just sort of acknowledging the wider context that we're working in with regards to the influences and the opportunities facing the rural sector. So obviously the fallout from the autumn budget continues with the proposed inheritance tax changes and still an awful lot of lobbying and messages going back to government about the impact of those changes. There was a major gathering of farmers and those representing the sector in Whitehall yesterday, and we've now had supermarkets joining the calls for a review of those proposals. It remains to be seen what, if anything, will change off the back of that, but as it stands, nothing has shifted, and we can anticipate those changes incoming unless anything changes. We also know that we've got a spending review coming up where we may see changes to departmental budgets, and overall that creates a challenging context for the land-based sector in terms of cash flow challenges, increased cost of doing business off the back of other announcements made in the budget, reduction in BPS payments, and then potentially a future inheritance tax charge to plan for. So some quite challenging economic and financial circumstances there, and really that's the context within which we're going to talk about some of the planning policy changes and development opportunities that flow from that, acknowledging that backdrop, but also looking at the opportunities for development aligned to the new National Planning Policy Framework and other changes which may well provide the opportunity for development and capital receipts for landowners. The Environment Act and all of the mechanisms to ensure that the UK meets the binding targets that we've signed up to. Labour have reasserted their commitment to that, but they are looking at the ways in which we are going to respond and implement those things, particularly the role that development plays in that, and Nicole will touch a little bit on that. And then, of course, that flows through into opportunities with regard to nature markets, which again, remain fairly immature, but evolving and adapting at pace, presenting another opportunity for landowners to consider different income generation options. very recent announcement, consultation has kicked off on the land use framework. So the land use framework and sort of another framework, but not designed in any way to replace, but to sit alongside planning policy. And this won't have immediate implications for landowners, but is certainly one to watch. And what this really responds to is a conversation that's been going on for quite a few years now about that increasing need to balance land use and make choices and inevitably trade-offs about what we use our land for. Of course, food and food production and the role that that plays in public health and also food security continues to dominate. But there are increasing demands on our rural land for nature recovery, for climate change, and of course for development. So that consultation will be really key in terms of how that land use framework is taken forward and how that then sits alongside planning policy. So as ever, a lot going on. The planning policy changes are the things that have been implemented first and most quickly by the government, and there are further changes to come. But we're going to focus largely on those today because they are creating immediate opportunities and time-limited opportunities and things to respond to. So I'm going to ask Nicole to first of all just talk through those macro changes, and then we'll get into some of the specifics. Nicole.
Thank you, Sally, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. So I'm going to spend 5 minutes or so just giving you an overview, really, of the various changes in planning. There's been quite a focus on reforming our planning system, but I'm going to sort of start by just giving a little bit of a reflection on 2024. So where were we last year? In my mind, last year, most businesses and individuals were probably still recovering from the impacts of COVID and just getting used to supply chains getting back to normal and grappling with those emerging realities of Brexit. Then, of course, we had that 10% biodiversity net gain obligation coming into force in February. And then, of course, for smaller sites in April. Of course, this was introduced at a time when we were already dealing with nutrient neutrality impacts, frustrating the planning system. And the challenges that all of these brought meant that there were new innovative solutions coming forward from landowners and developers in rising to the challenge to provide new nature-based solutions and respond to a provision of credits, nutrient neutrality credits, and biodiversity units. With habitat banks developing. So we have risen to that challenge. And of course, with the election and our new government in place, we had introduced what was the government's plan for change. And that plan for change introduced with it 5 national missions. And those were focused on growth, clean energy, and breaking down barriers to finding opportunities for all. And of course, we couldn't go without the improvements to the NHS that are under consideration and safer streets. But the latter, the latter couple we won't touch on today. Now, the key focuses which we're going to be looking at today are with regards to the growth that plan for change is aiming to deliver. And that plan for change is aiming to deliver that growth through speeding up decision-making processes in planning, improving the consistency of our planning framework, and reducing the costs of planning to all. And so it focused with delivery of that speeding up, improved consistency and reduced costs. We're looking at introducing what will be 3 consultations that we're responding to at the moment. Next slide, please. And those are, of course, focusing on streamlining infrastructure planning, looking at how development and nature recovery are going to be addressed going forward, modernizing our planning committees, so that's our decision-making framework. And we have what Sally has referred to as that land use framework through that land use consultation that opened on the 31st of last month of January. Now, with the changes that are being introduced through that land use framework, we are looking at ensuring that there will be a system where all data will be available, that the government is consulting not only on and introducing that framework, which it says will be introduced without fail by June this year. So in June 2025, we'll have a new land use framework for England. And that land use framework will be a response to the consultation that's currently open. And we can touch on what that involves. And so in addition to bringing in that framework, we're looking at a toolkit that will sit alongside that framework, which will be used, although it's not directly a planning tool, it will influence planning decisions. So it will be a material consideration in decision making, which local planning authorities will need to take into account. It will ensure that land use data and analysis supports innovative decision making and spatial planning decisions. And there will be a co-creation of plans for delivery. So it's looking at ensuring that the right skills and data incentives and structures are in place to ensure positive decision making in planning. The nature recovery consultation, which is also open and opened a few weeks ago, is sitting alongside this, is also looking at proposing that a funding regime is in place to deliver the environmental improvements. So there is what is referred to as a new nature recovery fund. So at the moment, that seems to be mainly focused on nutrient neutrality, which means that there will be a commuted sum effectively paid on applications submitted, and then there will be more strategic delivery focus of solutions. Whether that will touch on the biodiversity net gain at BNG 10% is unknown at this point. The government says at the moment it is not, but who knows how things will evolve going forward. And so we will be talking about this with various stakeholders in preparing a response. Rural Solutions will be preparing responses to all these 4 consultations that are currently open, and we will be doing that in consultation with various clients and stakeholders. So if you would like to contribute to that discussion, do get in touch with us. We will be happy to share your views on that. So on another very important consultation that's open is that consultation on the modernization of planning committees. Now, it's being referred to as the modernization of planning committees, but it's focusing on ensuring that delegated decisions can be promoted within local planning authorities for applications that are compliant with the local plan. So applications that are compliant with the local plan effectively should never be taken to committee if this consultation achieves what it's determined to achieve, so that you can speed up the decision-making process by ensuring that applications that are in accordance with the development plan are delegated by the officers, by the planning officers within the local planning authority. It also proposes that there will be strategic committees, so that there are contentious applications that would then end up going to a planning committee. And it also focuses on ensuring that the right level of training is provided not only to the officers, but also to the committee members. Because often we are faced with situations where important information that we would expect to be known by both officers and committee members is not clear to them. So it will ensure that there's greater clarity and provide a statutory framework that can support that. So there's also the streamlining of infrastructure planning consultation ongoing at the moment. That's focused more on NSIPs, on National Strategic Infrastructure Projects, and that of course is looking at changing the regime, but also not only changing the policies that guide that process, but also changing the pre-application process to ensure that the statutory consultees who get consulted on the application are able to provide responses in a more consistent way and in a timely manner, but also as well as the pre-application stage is focusing on changes at the application stage during the consideration of those applications, and on the delivery stage trying to ensure that there is a much quicker process to achieving variation at the end of the stage, so you can have an easier change occurring. We're proposing if a development consent order is granted and that needs to be varied, it's easier to achieve a variation of that DCO. Now, we're proposing that given what the government is consulting on in this sort of streamlining infrastructure consultation, that an equivalent, more strategic and comprehensive approach should be taken in the review of decision making on planning applications that are determined by the local planning authorities, and that process, instead of just focusing on streamlining and improving the process and modernizing the planning committees, it should focus also on the consultation process, on the pre-application stages and the post-determination stages, so the delivery and variation of applications, so that we can ensure that effectiveness, that consistency and reduction in the cost of obtaining planning consents can be achieved at these application stages as well. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So there were a number of publications last year and earlier this year as part of the reform of the planning system to ensure that that growth that the government is planning to achieve of 1.5 million new homes, we've all heard of it undoubtedly, 1.5 million new homes to be constructed during this parliament, and so that in order to achieve that growth, that reform of the planning system is needed. But in addition to achieving that growth, we're looking at ensuring that the right level of infrastructure is in place. And so that's the reason for ensuring that that infrastructure planning is revamped and reformed as well, alongside the changes to the planning system to deliver that 1.5 million new homes. So of course, at the heart of the decision-making framework, at the heart of the planning policy framework sits the national planning policy framework, which is at a national level all local plans at a local level must be compliant with that national planning policy framework. And of course, the government had promised, as soon as the government arrived in office in July in 2024, we had a consultation on a revision to the national planning policy framework. We were promised that that revision would come as a published final document by the end of 2024, and that ambition was met. And on the 12th of December, I believe it was, we had that new national planning policy framework. Of course, as is usually the case, that gets varied soon after publication because inconsistencies or errors are identified and changes are needed. And only last week, Friday, we had a revised version published of the National Planning Policy Framework. And what does that new National Planning Policy Framework entail? Of course, guiding the delivery of the housing primarily and any new commercial development, as well as the objectives of achieving climate change and reducing the impact of carbon emissions. There is a very strong focus on encouraging renewable development. There is also, of course, all of the enabling that's expected to be within the framework with regards to housing, and the reintroduction of the mandatory housing targets is within it has been reintroduced as part of that national planning policy framework. What does that mean? That means that all the local planning authorities across the country have a mandatory number of houses, target figure of houses that they need to deliver. And that equates to 370,000 new homes per annum across all the local planning authorities, which gets us thereabouts of over 1.5 million target. But of course, as well as ensuring that we've reintroduced the mandatory housing targets, the government has also restored the 5-year housing land supply rules, which, what does that mean again? That means that as well as ensuring that there is a target number of houses for each local planning authority to deliver within a 5-year period, that target, it has to be monitored. And so every year, the local planning authorities must publish the number of houses that they have achieved and delivered in that previous year. And that number and that target, if not met, means that there is a potential opportunity which is introduced by the tilted balance, which James may talk a little bit more through. We've also had the introduction of the grey belt, which is a classification of land. We've all been familiar with brownfield land as a classification of land. The new National Planning Policy Framework has introduced a classification of land within the green belt, which is grey belt land, which provides that opportunity for certain development to take place within the green belts, depending on whether they are appropriate by the new definition of grey belt. And I won't go through that in too much detail because I'm coming to the end of my part of the presentation. But also the green belt policy has been amended to ensure that local planning authorities can achieve a number of new allocations within their green belt areas. So there is a little bit more flexibility introduced and a review of the annual housing numbers, and a review of the allocation of housing brings about with it an opportunity for greenbelt land to be introduced into the equation, and local planning authorities to assess whether it is necessary and possible to look at expanding their allocations within their greenbelt areas. So this is the end of my section. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicole. So I'm just going to come back in here, and I'm the non-planner on the call, but there's a method in that, because I think, as Nicole has articulated, there's a lot going on. There's lots of policies, papers, consultations, frameworks, and I think it can feel a bit sort of impenetrable. And what we're hoping to do is kind of really bring this down from that sort of macro level context that Nicole has presented through to opportunities at site and landowner-led specific opportunities. So the things that Nicole has just talked about, those changes in that national planning policy context, what that then means is that each local planning authority will need to respond to those things to make sure that they are aligning their local planning policy with what that national context is. And what that means is that almost all local planning authorities will need to either review or create an entirely new local development plan. And so I'm conscious that even in saying that, it's not necessarily widely understood what that means. And I know, given who's on the call today, there'll be some of you who do know this, and so bear with us for those that do, but others that are sort of a kind of 101 in what all of this stuff means, we thought would be useful. So I'll start with, first of all, what is a local development plan? So if you go into the next slide. So all local authorities are required to have a local development plan in place, and effectively that's the instruction manual, if you like, for what can be built and where within that local planning authority area through the duration of that plan. So it's a document that's created by the local authority, and it sets out what the development needs and opportunities are within the area, and then how those development needs will be met, focusing on housing, businesses, infrastructure, and so on. And then it sets out that roadmap that then guides local decision making in terms of where planning consent is granted. And so on the next slide, I've just got a real headline view of sort of the process that local authorities will go through. And so the starting point is to gather the evidence. So what actually are the needs within the local area that need to be addressed through development? And then what is the volume of land that we're going to need in order to meet those development requirements? So that's the first section. The second phase that they go through then is looking at the options. So as ever, there will be different ways in which to meet these development needs, either through policy or through the decisions about what land will be developed. And so then those things taken into consideration, the local authority will decide, okay, this is how we're going to meet those development requirements. And so they'll set out a plan, a draft plan that then will be widely consulted on with stakeholders and the local community to comment on that plan. At the point at which they've reached that they're happy with that plan, that then goes into the planning inspectorate for examination to determine and make sure that it aligns with the NPPF and is fit for purpose. And then the inspector will approve, or sometimes send it back to the local authority, but approve that plan, which is then adopted. And at the point at which it's adopted, the policies within that then come into effect. And the timeline and the life cycle of these plans can be 10, 15, 20 years. So they really do have quite an impact in terms of decision making on what can be developed and where. And so throughout that process, there are opportunities for people to engage with the process, both in terms of influencing policy, but also in terms of putting forward land. So a phrase that you'll hear is a call for sites consultation. And effectively what that means is it's a local authority asking for sites to be put forward and proposed for development for the different requirements within the plan. And so that's a really key point at which to engage with that plan as either a developer or a land promoter or a landowner to put forward land. The submission requirements are quite straightforward, sometimes as simple as just a kind of red line on a plan, but obviously rural sites need to work that little bit harder. So usually there is a need to put forward additional information about the suitability of that site, because in nearly every instance a local authority will have more land submitted than it requires. So then there's a decision-making process to determine which sites are then taken forward and allocated within the plan. There's an opportunity at the issues and options consultation stage, which is where different policies are being looked at to influence policy and seek to have policies included in those plans that are kind of friendly towards rural development. So an example might be a policy that specifically acknowledges the role that rural estates play in the vibrancy of rural communities and the wider benefits that they deliver. So not only submitting specific plans, but also the opportunity to influence policy. Usually the call for sites processes come out and are published with kind of set dates. You know, it opens on this date and 6 weeks later that call for sites window closes. In actual fact, there's usually opportunity beyond that process to put forward sites and also to put additional information forward about sites that are within that. So they're good in terms of kind of focusing attention in getting sites put forward. But if you see that you might have missed one, or there's a call for sites process in your area that's very close to its conclusion, don't necessarily assume that you've missed your window. Because there will be chance beyond that. Of course, sites that go forward for consideration, the authority then needs to determine which ones of those they want to allocate. And effectively an allocation means that that site is then counted as part of the land supply in that local area. And then even allocated sites will still need to go through a planning application process, but having that allocation is really setting that kind of presumption in favour of approval, because by allocating a site, an authority is determining that it believes it's suitable for development for the uses put forward. There's obviously a big focus on housing, and that is what James is going to talk about in quite a bit of detail. But a lot of these called for sites are also interested in sites for nature recovery, commercial development, infrastructure, leisure and tourism. So it isn't solely housing. But hopefully that just gives you a bit more insight into that process in relatively simple terms. As they can feel, there's lots of kind of language and jargon around these things, but they are really important and really genuine opportunities to influence at a local level. So I am going to hand you over to James, who is going to talk to you about some of the specific opportunities with regard to housing sites.
Thank you, Sally. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'll go on to speak about rural housing. I'll go on to speak about green belt, grey belt, some of the other policy changes. We'll look at some live examples that are anonymised from where we're working with clients, which will hopefully give people an insight into some of these policy changes and the impacts that they're having. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, we don't need to touch upon the housing increases. Nicole's touched upon that. It's been headline news since almost July in terms of the BBC, national newspapers about increases in housing numbers. The implication for rural areas is that there are significantly increased housing targets. Some big cities haven't seen housing numbers go up much. but due to affordability issues, many rural areas where we work have seen significantly increased numbers. Some areas, their housing numbers have increased, they've doubled. Some areas have tripled, and some areas have even quadrupled. And this is based on the number that they had to provide of houses per year before the new government came in, compared to what they will need to plan for moving forward. So this creates a significantly increased demand for land suitable for housing development, and it creates significant opportunities for rural landowners who want to make use of that opportunity. And we'll come on to some examples, but one of the specific responses that we're seeing across the country to these increased targets is that local authorities are starting work now on new local development plans, and they're undertaking these call for sites and asking for land to be put forward. Some authorities which didn't have to do anything in kind of policy making terms for the next 3, 4, 5 years because of the stage that they were in the local plan cycle, are now starting to plan for these greater housing numbers. What we're also seeing what we also saw in the National Planning Policy Framework was greater policy support for small and medium sites, which could be beneficial to many rural landowners. So that increased policy support is really helpful when we're submitting planning applications, when we're submitting land for allocations for the incremental growth of rural villages. And as well as submitting sites, as Sally spoke about, to be allocated in local plans, there could be many opportunities to submit applications in the short term, because if a local authority doesn't have enough housing land to meet 5 years of its annual housing need, moving forward, in broad terms, a planning application should be approved even if the land is unallocated on the edge of a village or if it's outside of development boundaries. And the increased housing targets have made it much more difficult for many rural authorities to demonstrate that they've got 5 years of land to meet their future needs. We'll come on to an example, but if we can move on to the next slide. So this is an anonymised example of a new rural village that we submitted to a local plan for consideration last month. It's an authority in the Midlands. Their housing numbers almost doubled as a result of the government changes. And as a result, it decided to start work on a new local plan. The current local plan runs until the early 2030s, so it could have done very little from a policy-making perspective over the next few years, but it realised it was going to have to find new housing land or be at risk of applications coming in on unallocated sites. So together with designers in Rural Solutions, we worked on this site. We've looked at how we can incorporate housing, a kind of publicly accessible nature reserve at the centre, including employment areas and also a services area. And I think in terms of new villages, it's a really interesting response to some of the housing targets, because the government's talked about new towns and 10,000 houses. That creates real huge infrastructure requirements, and it can take a long time for the houses to come on stream. I think with a rural village, a new rural village, it can create benefits for the local area in terms of services, and it also creates services such as, say, an extra care scheme, shops, cafes that can be brought on stream relatively quickly. So that's just one example. Another example is of a landowning family that's seeking to reuse a former farm site due to some deaths in the family. So it wants to seek housing development on this land. The local authority where this land is based is at a very, very advanced stage in finalising its local plan, and that doesn't allocate the site. Now, the government, whilst it increased significantly the housing number for this area, in order not to be seen to have an unfair impact on councils that have made good progress with their local plans, that local authority can continue with its current housing number, and it can continue with its current local plan and get that adopted by government later this year. But almost immediately after that, it has to start work again on a new local plan, which will look at future land allocations. Without the government changes, this land wouldn't have had the opportunity for housing development for 10, 15 years. As a result of the government changes and the authority having to start again on a new plan, as soon as the advanced draft one is finalised, there could be an opportunity to get an allocation on this land in the next 2-3 years. So again, a direct impact of the change. Next slide, please. Again, an anonymised example of some estate land. It's the small square at the centre of the image. The estate has put this land forward for a call for sites process with a local authority, which is looking to create a local plan which will allocate housing sites by 2028. What these significant housing numbers increases mean is that in this area there isn't a 5-year housing land supply. So the application, an application could be submitted, next month, and would have to be assessed positively by the local authority. And Nicole spoke briefly about the tilted balance, and a housing application on this site would have to be approved unless there were adverse impacts which significantly outweighed the benefits. So there's a tilted balance in favour of housing applications being approved. So unforeseen opportunities for this estate client based on the government changes. Next slide, please. So yeah, just to recap on the housing section before we move on to Greenbelt. So there's these significantly increased housing numbers across a local authority area. They must, include a proportionate increase in rural housing. In our view, there's opportunities across the country for rural landowners to promote land for allocation in new local plans. As Sally said, there are defined periods where they have a call for sites consultation, but many councils will accept sites with concept plans at any point in the process. There could be the opportunities to submit short-term planning applications based on local land supply. I think one person asked a question about neighbourhood plans, and one of the only situations when you can't submit a short-term planning application is if there's a neighbourhood plan for an area and that includes housing allocations, and the neighbourhood plan looks to deliver housing. Not all neighbourhood plans do that. Some neighbourhood plans just deal with design policies and things like that. But if there's a neighbourhood plan that allocates housing, there's effectively a 5-year window from the period of adoption of that neighbourhood plan where short-term applications would be very difficult. I think in our view as a practice, there are some real strategic opportunities for larger scale developments in rural areas, particularly if they are delivering services and they're delivering benefits to rural areas. We've sat with senior politicians for a big rural county, and they said our market towns, they've grown by 50 houses, lots of 50 house applications over the years. What we're looking for and what that authorities call for, they've said they want to see new village proposals submitted. They don't want to see extensions of extensions. Ultimately, they'll have to receive extensions of extensions, but they're also looking at places that are less politically sensitive that can provide strategic housing numbers. So there are some real opportunities there if there's an element of services, mixed use, and the right approach to development. And I think moving on to the next point, quality, the next point, not the next slide. Quality is really important. So it's not a case of anything goes. We've heard national government say this. We've heard local government reiterate this at an officer level. They want to see high quality developments that they can approve. It's not just a case of getting out the calculator and allowing anything to create a housing land supply. And as a practice, we've got architects, landscape architects in-house. We work with landowners who are often very passionate about developing in their own backyard and really want to deliver a legacy development. And that's also really important from a planning process, because ultimately the test might be, do the adverse impacts significantly outweigh the benefits? So we work on sensitive proposals where we mitigate the adverse impacts through design, and we also promote benefits through good quality placemaking and try and deliver benefits to local communities That might be publicly accessible EV charging points. It could include nature walking trails on a site. There's a whole host of different benefits that you can include on a site depending on scale alongside housing. So yeah, next slide, please, because the green belt has caused a lot of kind of media coverage about changes to the green belt. It's almost a kind of a sacred cow in the national agenda, the green belt. But the government has really made clear that local authorities must release land from green belt where development needs require this to be the case. And this is quite different to the 2023 NPPF, which Michael Gove has admitted had some kind of mistakes in it and could have been seen as quite anti-development. What the current NPPF says, if your housing needs require it, you must release greenbelt land for development in shorthand. There's also a new grey belt definition, which we'll come on to, and that doesn't just mean brownfield sites. It can include greenfield land. But if you do have a brownfield site in greenbelt, there are also some other policy changes, which means that the volume of new buildings that you can provide on that brownfield site can be increased. So if you have say a building on a brownfield site in greenbelt, the new test is that that application should be approved unless there's a substantial impact on the openness of the greenbelt. Previously, the volume of the building to replace the building had to be similar. Now it's gone from no greater impact to no significant impact. So touching upon grey belt specifically, so as I mentioned, it can include brownfield and greenfield sites. A lot of the discussion in the national media has talked about brownfield sites that could be reused, but it can also include greenfield sites. And land is considered to be grey belt if it doesn't strongly contribute. So strongly contribute is obviously a high test to these three greenbelt purposes. So checking the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, preventing neighbouring towns merging into one another. Often when we're dealing with land on the edge of villages, that won't apply because there aren't any towns in the local area. And one of the other purposes of greenbelt is to preserve the setting and special character of historic towns. We are expecting further government guidance on this quite imminently, but we're already starting to see a lot of appeal decisions from government planning inspectors approving land for housing development on the basis that it is grey belt. And if we just move on to one, again, anonymised landholding that we're working on, you don't see the wider context, but there's a village to the north of this landholding. There's a village to the south of this landholding. And there are various areas of this land which might now be considered grey belt. There's an equestrian centre at the middle of the landholding. That could be considered grey belt. The land to the east of the equestrian centre, that's greenfield, but it's not really contributing anything as a linear strip to the area. That could be considered grey belt. Could some of the land to the south of the landholding be considered grey belt? Quite possibly. The green belt in this area, it's not protecting the character of a historic town. It's between two villages, so it's not. The purpose of the green belt in this area isn't to create two neighbouring towns merging into one another. So there could be, live opportunities for the landowner that we're discussing with them as a result of the government changes to planning in the 2024 framework. So that's just one example, and there was a House of Lords paper on the changes that was in the national press recently. They were querying how many houses would be delivered as a result of the grey belt change, but certainly for rural areas, it could have some quite significant changes for landowners to submit land and receive approval. Just to touch upon some other policy changes briefly, if we could move on to the next slide. So renewable energy, lots of messages from government about net zero and low carbon, and we've seen a lot of changes in the NPPF last year. There's much greater support for renewable and low carbon development in policy. There was a de facto ban on onshore wind turbines in national planning policy, whereby if you got one objection to your wind turbine, it couldn't go ahead. Obviously, most onshore wind turbines will create much more than one objection, so a de facto ban. That's now being removed. And there are also changes to planning policy, which creates significant support for energy efficiency measures and changes to existing buildings. So any landowners with a historic building, be it listed or non-listed, there's real strong support now for low carbon and renewable energy developments in those buildings, on those buildings. Solar panels and heat pumps are specifically mentioned. And then finally, one change to flood risk policy, which is slightly more pragmatic than previous planning policy. So previously, if you had flood risk anywhere within the red line boundary of your site, it could be very, very difficult to secure planning consent. You would have to prove that there were no other sites in the local authority's area without flood risk that could accommodate development. And that's regardless of whether there were housing or green spaces on the flood risk areas. It would be irregardless of what the actual flood risk was. The fact that you had a blue dot on your land could make it very difficult. Whereas a new approach means that you can develop in these sites that have flood zone areas on them. All you have to do is not put a building on the flood zone. So there could be many rural sites, as we see, where you can, put housing outside of the flood zone areas, outside of the surface water or fluvial flood zone areas, but you can put natural capital in the flood risk area. You can put landscaping, you can put play areas. So that will, for many rural landowners, be a game changer in terms of the opportunities to gain planning permission on as a result of the policy changes last year. So that's a kind of a whistle-stop tour. Other than economic development through the policy changes, there isn't any specific change in terms of rural economic development in the framework. There was already a section called supporting a prosperous rural economy that has been retained, and I think the messages coming from government about growth mean that identical policy should be given more weight in the decision-making process. There is an addition to policy which talks about greater support for industries of local, regional or national importance. Now, in some urban areas, what's of local importance will be very different to what's in rural areas. We would say that tourism is a key industry for many rural locations, as is agriculture, as are many other sectors. So we would really strongly emphasise a strong economic benefits case, with an application. What is the benefit of tourism to a local economy? How important is that as a part of GDV of the local economy? That's the case that we'd be making, and we'd also be making the case that on a development specific basis, these are the economic benefits that this development would deliver in terms of jobs, in terms of spending in the local area. So not too many changes for rural economic development, but a lot of messages from government and this policy reference to industries of local importance that we can use to promote landowners' developments. Thank you. Those are just some examples of projects that we've worked on, which are more rural economic development focused, but I'll hand it back to Sally.
Thanks, James. I'm really conscious of time, and we've had quite a few questions come in. So just a real very quick recap, just on the next slide, that the changes in planning policy have been, I've heard, described as seismic, and certainly I don't think there's been as positive a planning environment for rural development, certainly since the initial adoption of the NPPF. So now really is the time to move. Local authorities are under a lot of pressure to get these new local development plans in place. We're going to see a lot of local plan reviews, a lot of call for sites. I can think of half a dozen that have emerged just in the past couple of weeks. I think at last count we've got 80 local authorities who don't have a 5-year housing land supply, so they'll be under real pressure to have sites suitable for development. So taking on board all of the context that we've set out in terms of the kind of the quality and appropriateness development proposals, then there really is a really one-off opportunity over the next 6 to 12 months to really have a look at opportunities at sort of site and estate specific level. So I will leave it there. We have had some questions come in. So Finlo, would you like to drive us through this bit?
Lovely, thank you. And as you say, we've only got another 7 or 8 minutes to work through these. And Sally, if I can stick with you for the first one, which is how does the government's devolution drive or timetable affect the LDP process in those areas where both are being considered?
Yeah, it's not too much of a politician's answer. It sort of depends. In theory, because a lot of the initial work that's required is around evidence gathering and getting that baseline data together, which is quite time consuming, the individual district in an area that may well become a unitary authority in the future can start to do that. There's been, I think, another 6 authorities announced this week on the devolution priority programme, some fairly significant rural areas, Norfolk and Suffolk as one, Cumbria, Hampshire and the Solent. So a lot of it will depend on how mature the local plan review process is at the point at which the unitary comes into being, the aim for those authorities being May 2026. So it may well delay the final adoption of the plan, but I think we can anticipate actually a lot of the groundwork that's being done, and those authorities that know they're going to go through this process coordinating more closely so that work then rolls forward into a new area-wide plan. We had a slightly different experience in North Yorkshire, who became a unitary last year, whereby there were local plans that were fairly well developed, and they didn't in fact roll over, and there's been a second call for sites process has run. I would expect that with the authorities that know, certainly in those 6 areas, that this is that they're working on those proposals and preparations, that they would make sure that a lot of that work and preparation can be rolled forward.
Thanks, Sally. James, there's a request here just to sort of flesh out one of your sort of previous points, and this is the opportunity to influence local planning policy was mentioned. Can you say a bit more about this and specifically what sort of policies it might be possible to influence?
Thank you, Finlo. Yeah, as well as submitting sites, we often take a really close interest in what policies a local plan is going to include, and that can be from the issues and options stage to the looking at the draft policies, and really commenting on those. We work in a lot of rural areas. We want to make sure that planning policies which say allow housing on the edge of villages without a planning application are sufficiently flexible, that there's support for self-build developments in villages as well, which is an important part of supply. We also look at what policies state concerning rural economic development, and we'd always recommend that a landowner who's got long-term interest really closely looks at what the policies and the draft policies are stating, because if not, those are the policies that are going to be used to decide your planning applications for the next 15 or 20 years. Something that we also do, particularly working with rural estates, is we promote whole estate plan policies. There's a lot of kind of forward-thinking authorities, and particularly national parks. Speaking to one of the questions that's also come in the chat, many national parks and other authorities which do create a specific policy for rural estates, and if you can show a kind of joined up plan of what you're going to be doing across your land holding over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that can actually accrue you additional support in the planning process. So that's something that a policy that we advocate to many authorities. There's going to be a policy in the Yorkshire Dales National Park local plan because of a submission that we made. We've created a whole estate plans in the South Downs. The New Forest National Park is consulting on its local plan at the moment and hasn't mentioned estate plans, so we'll be writing to them and really advocating the benefits to them and their rural areas of including that policy.
Lovely. You touched on national parks there, but there's a sort of it's a point really that just says that national parks. There always seems to be a big but regarding planning in national parks. Can you riff around that?
Yes, there is. National parks are they're taken out of the kind of short-term housing land supply application opportunity route, but they're not immune to looking at meeting housing need in their area. And we work with national park policy planners on a regular basis. They also have to create policies which support economic development, and the policies in the National Planning Policy Framework, which we touched on about local industries of importance, they equally apply to any planning applications. So they're not immune by any stretch of the imagination to some of the pro-growth policy drivers that we're seeing, but they do have a level of protection which Rural Solutions and I'm sure many landowners would advocate. It's about getting the right balance, and often we have to advocate a slight movement away from protectionism to allowing vibrant communities and economies. It depends on the different national park authority. They've got slightly different cultures across the country.
Yeah, lovely. We started 2 minutes late, so I'm going to allow one more question, James. And again, it's to you. But do we think, and perhaps if you just give me sort of 60 seconds on this, do we think that the role of neighbourhood plans will be strengthened in the new framework, reduced, or remain the same? And for those neighbourhood plans that have design codes or guides in them, do we see those as playing a greater role in shaping plans coming forward for development?
I think the process will largely remain the same. The opportunity has been there since around 2012 for neighbourhoods who want to create a neighbourhood plan. As I mentioned, those neighbourhood plans which do deal with housing, and by deal with housing I mean allocate housing or give housing policies in there. They do get a kind of 5-year period from the adoption date of the neighbourhood plan, from which short-term planning applications by landowners, by developers are very difficult. So those neighbourhoods that have created a plan over the last couple of years, may well be the ones who have more protection in inverted commas from development over the next few years. Whether the policy changes and the pressure on some authorities, particularly those in the affluent areas that are affected by greenbelt changes, whether that leads more neighbourhood plans to be created, it may well do, and that's something we'll be monitoring for local landowners.
I said that was the last. I'm going to have one final one, which is just for Nicole. And it's a follow-on in relation to the national parks. And it's just a question of whether we might see a relaxation in terms of permitted development in protected landscapes.
Well, that's something, time will tell. It's something that we've advocated for in the recent consultations, and we hope to see. And with the positive approach to planning our current government is appearing to take, we are hopeful that it is something that will be coming forward. But I think that national parks are open to that happening. I was at a conference with the National Parks Partnership only last week, or it might have been the week before, the weeks fly by, where the national parks were saying that they haven't had a lot of development coming forward since the BNG 10% rule came into play. And of course, they are looking for opportunities to work with landowners in a positive way. So, I think time will tell, but fingers crossed this will be something coming forward.
Lovely. Thanks so much, everyone. I think that's been a really comprehensive conversation, really interesting presentation. Some great questions. That is essentially all we have time for. It would be utterly negligent of me not to mention yet again 8.9.com, the number 8, the word point, the number 9.com, and also to mention Farmgate's Filling the Funding Gap podcast series, which is running at the moment, in which we're looking at how natural capital markets can help to fill the gap between public payments and the actual costs of transition to more regenerative land use. So if you have any interest in natural capital markets and want to find out more, we've got a dozen programs going out at the moment on the Farmgate channel. So thank you for that. And Sally, can I just hand over to you perhaps to close the webinar?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. If there's anything that we've talked about today that you would like to follow up, then you'll find us all on LinkedIn, or in your invitation to join today. You'll have a contact detail for us, and you'll also get a recording for this. So feel free to share it with others that you think might find it useful. So thank you, and thank you, Finlay.